Make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region. For we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean and the Caribbean and the Caribbean.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, our open word edition. Push one intention for the Caribbean man and Caribbean woman. The integration instinct is still prevalent. The Black Stallion would have done that in 1979, that calypso that he won the crown with, and still is the anthem of regional integration. We continue to press on. This past week, of course, there was the Canada-Caribbean Summit, and one can only hope that coming out of these engagements that the regional movement is enhanced. So welcome again to Politics 101, our open word edition. If you're joining us from Guyana, welcome. I say a special hello to the people of West Bobis. Welcome to our program. If you're joining us from the wider Caribbean, welcome. Those of you out in North America, Canada, the United States of America, a special good evening to the people there in Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., and of course, our loyal viewers in Europe. You know, it didn't occur to me, it's 5 hours, 5 hours ahead of Guyana, so it's now midnight in England, and you all are staying up with the program, and it's simply amazing. We're eternally grateful to you. How about those of you who join us from France? A very good evening to you, and not forgetting the people in French Guyana and those of us in Suriname. Welcome to our program tonight, and we will be talking to Professor Clive Thomas. Of course, big in the news this week, the political news, the opposition leader and the president met, and they came out with a joint statement. And there are many people, most people, it seems, welcome that move. Some are arguing that the opposition leader should have played hardball, given the fact that the president had said he was not going to meet with him unless he shook his hand, and here he was meeting with him without a shake hand. People are questioning the sincerity of the PPP. We're going to get some quick comments on that from Professor Clive Thomas, who is our regular guest. On the oil and gas front, big development. Chevron has bought out Hess's share in the Stabroek block. For $53 billion. I think by the time they pay Hess shareholders, it would go up to $60 billion. Significant development, because it means now American companies would control 75% of that Stabroek block, because Exxon has 45%. Now Chevron, which is another big American company, they have 30%, and of course the 25% the Chinese company. So it's a big development, and of course one asks the question always, why now? Why are they selling out now? Why Chevron? What does this mean? What does it tell us? I know one thing it tells us is that that stumbling block is lucrative. It's lucrative. But we're going to ask Professor Thomas to talk to us about the meaning of this new development. And of course, there has been a lot of talk these last couple of days about taxation and tax evasion and tax, those companies that are not paying their fair share of taxes. We're going to talk about that. We're going to ask Professor Clive Thomas to walk us through this whole question of taxes, whether there is a difference between tax evasion and trying to lower your tax. All those things we're going to talk about. So welcome to our program tonight, and I want to thank those of you who took the time out to send comments. I know there were a few questions, but I'll deal with that tomorrow. Today, I want us to get into the tough issues. They're tough because they're important. And of course, there are narratives on these issues out there, competing narratives. So we want to weigh in on the issues and see where we go. Let's bring in Professor Thomas. Professor Thomas, good evening.
Good evening, David.
I'm getting a little echo there from you.
I have a blackout.
Oh, my goodness.
It just came while you were speaking.
Oh, my goodness. Well,
10 seconds ago, yeah.
All right, let's see how far we will get in the circumstances. That Canada CARICOM summit. These summits, we have seen summits with the United States before. I think this may be the first Canada CARICOM summit. Any usefulness to it from your standpoint?
Well, Canada has been a major benefactor to the region and been a major place where a number of Caribbean people have migrated to. So I think any close relationship between the two areas would be of immense value to the Caribbean region. So that is important. I think the priority of going to or setting up Haiti as the challenge for the region is a good one, because that's the major problem. And I don't think the CARICOM region has the resources to tackle that on its own, particularly the security resources that would be required unless you were to send another military expedition there, because we had one before.
Yeah.
So let's see what happens.
Yeah.
Most of these agreements are always more hopeful, and we have to rely on what actuates to give a measure of how important and effective it is.
Yes.
I wish it well.
Yeah. You mentioned Haiti, and that has been a persistent problem long before the present era. Why we can't seem to get it right when it comes to Haiti?
Well, because Haiti is disproportionately large to the rest of CARICOM in terms of population, in terms of area, in terms of military security challenges. It's a serious problem for a small region like CARICOM to handle on its own. So I think we need some help, and help from the Canadians. I'm hoping might be more positive than has been the case before.
And of course, a lot of people are opposed, as we are, to the another military operation there.
Yeah, of course.
In the absence of the military operation, what approach should we take?
Well, I think if we are to send people there, if CARICOM to exercise any influence there, we have to give security guarantees. We have to generate the equivalent of a security apparatus in the country, because it has clearly broken down, at least from my looking at it from here. It is clearly broken down. I don't think they have a functioning police force or other security forces in the country that can support the state and the political class. And that is in contention because gangs are apparently running riot. And if you have such a breakdown, that's where you have to start as number one. A state must have collective control over the ultimate force within the country.
Yes, and coming closer to home, Venezuela, there are lots of developments over there.
Yeah.
Of course, we have the border thing, which we'll come to in a minute, but the Venezuelans, the Americans seem to have eased the sanctions on Venezuela. Any significance to that?
A lot. When we come to discuss Chevron, we'll see.
We'll see.
Because what the Americans are clearly trying to do is to open up a second important basin for the American control within the southern parts of the Americas. And Brazil has that control now. And there's lots of talk of Brazil moving towards the BRICS. So there are already advanced negotiations I'm aware of, because it's been covered in some sections of the press, between the Venezuelan government and the United States government about the easing of sanctions within a period of maybe next 6 months or more, once certain conditions that have been agreed to are met, which means the whole Chevron deal has to be looked at in that context, and which puts Guyana in a very serious jeopardy. And it puts at risk all the things that we have been saying about the Stabroek Bloc and what it represents, which might come back to bite us. Because, you know, there's some groups who are so naive as to want the Stabroek Bloc to close down to save the environment, as they put it. And that might very well happen.
Yes.
Unintended consequences for us, yeah.
Unintended consequences. You've introduced Chevron, and so let's go straight there. This big buyout by Chevron of S's share of the Stabroek Bloc. How significant, how big is that?
Well, it's a total buyout, but I will have to correct you what you said at the beginning. It seemed to me as if you implied that it added some degree of further control for the Americans over the operations of the Stabroek Bloc. It doesn't. It substitutes Chevron for Hess. That's what the deal is. They're exchanging shares.
Uh-huh.
So Chevron will give them about $53 billion, or just around that figure. As you say, it might go up to about 60, in exchange for the Hess shares. So Hess becomes part of Chevron.
Uh-huh.
And the Hess leadership joins the Exxon board. Now, to understand that, you have to understand the complexities of the American oil and gas industry, because they have very many different factions there as well. Hess, not Exxon. Well, Exxon, I can probably start there. Exxon and Chevron are both what you call big oil, what the Americans call big oil. That is a major or a super major, if you want to call it, extended to that, which means they have among the highest market capitalizations of any petroleum firm within the United States. Hess is an independent, and these companies have played an important part, like Hess, in our being able to break out from the American domination of the oil sector, especially within the Middle East. So the growth of the Middle East depended on Middle Eastern oil companies, depended to a large extent on the piracy of the independents. because they broke the tradition of the dominant oil companies worldwide. The big seven sisters, as you know about, which dominated, which included European and American firms, Shell and Total and so forth. Their disintegration was important for the formation of OPEC. And the American independent firms, because they want capitalism to be competitive, and they were competing against the majors, and they played an important part in fostering the development of the production sharing agreement, the PSA. So underlying the PSA revolution has been the expansion of the role of the American independents, as they call themselves, within the oil sector. Chevron has emerged now as the second largest American company by market capitalization. I have to be careful in saying that because depending on the metric you use, different firms end up being the largest or smallest, or the size of ranking varies. Because you can measure oil companies by the number of employees, you can measure by the amount of oil they produce, you could mention by the amount of reserves they have or something like that. But what this measure that I'm using signifies is the market capital value of the firm. And Exxon Mobil is the largest, and Chevron is the second largest. So the coming together of the two top firms in terms of market capitalization in the United States is of significance. And underscores, I feel, that the extremely valuable nature of the oil assets that we have. I think any report you've seen, and I've read many, ranging from Bloomberg, CNBC, CNN, wherever I go, have been in mighty praise of Guyana. Over the last 10 years, by far the most exciting oil prospect that ever happened on Earth. So even though our local press and so on are poo-pooing Guyana, what I'm telling you here and what I have been arguing all along is that a miracle had been happening here by pure happenstance. And that is being vindicated again, because it brings out all the innate qualities of the finds that we've made so far, the Stabber block. The oil quality is good, it's light, it's sweet, it's easy to put into refineries and refine. It has that property of having low carbon emissions relative to other types of fuel. So it's considered a unique quality oil. And therefore, our crude oil is now in the hands of two of the top capitalized firms within the United States, which I'm sure will then guarantee that we'll have the technology or the technologies that we require to be able to exploit it fully. Because we can't do it without technology.
Right.
It costs $7 billion to one well, as you probably know. And if that is the case, then we can't find the resources to build it up by ourselves. We have to contract it out, and we have to rely on the revenues that we generate out of whatever contract we use to get the oil delivered. So I feel that this advertisement that has been generated by the comments all over the world about the significance of the find has been very good for Guyana. Its profile has never been better. And that is important for other reasons too, because we also want to raise our profile in a world where we've been challenged as to the ownership of the offshore oil, where we have territorial aggression being threatened. So it's turning out to be a good hand in terms of having to play a poker game at this point in time. But I don't know how long it will last and how careful we'll be in handling it as we go forward.
Mm.
But that basically is where we stand. So the Chevron substituted for Hess. I think we have more technological capabilities than Hess ever had, and Hess knows it because that's why they joined Chevron.
Uh-huh.
Their joining Chevron is evidence that they knew that they did not have the technology to help to take it forward. The question now is how will Chevron and ExxonMobil cooperate because they were previously supposedly rivals
Yeah.
because they were fighting for oil resources around the world. So
Mhm.
now we have to work with a careful, they have to work with it because we have nothing to do with it. A careful complementary relationship if we should continue along this successful path. Where both Chevron and ExxonMobil benefit from what Guyana has to offer. And they bring to bear on the output of oil and gas their capabilities and their technologies, which we do not have.
Would it not be? Go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were finished.
No, I finished that.
Would it not be, Professor Thomas, to our advantage if there is intense competition between Exxon and Chevron?
Yeah, but it depends on how we play it. We have to play a clever role because we are what they're both after. We can't be, I think, playing petty roles of tactical tactical games. We have to take a strategic position where the two majors are concerned, and we have to recognize that we don't, at this point in time, we're not sure that we have enough influence over the final decision making as we would like, because we don't know which of the global assets of both firms ultimately will make the decisions that they want for their own shareholders. Because that's what we have to play against.
Yeah.
Because they're both private conglomerates,
Yeah.
and they're working for their shareholders, not for us.
Professor, while we are on this issue, and you have been consistent in saying, look, objectively, what we have is really big, and we have to acknowledge that. But there are realities inside of Guyana, questions of division among our political forces, not the government itself has not been practicing what they now call good governance. And so a lot of people tend to be skeptical about the objective reality that, look, I mean, we have found a lot of oil. It's, as you said, good oil. It can bring so much wealth to us. But how do you square the two, where we have this good story there of that there is this oil and what's happening inside of the country? I
But
think
a
a
lot
lot
of that,
yes, go ahead.
would depend, David, on good governance.
Yes.
So that's the challenge that we have. It's a human challenge, and it's a challenge for Guyana. It depends on how we manage these resources, how we manage the relationships between the groups, how we manage the generation of knowledge and skills within our population. It depends on all those things because nobody here knows it all. Even though I might sound knowledgeable, there are people who also are knowledgeable who might be out there. The government has to work in a way in which they try to bring this knowledge to the fore and to bring the benefits of insights from other groups. I see the calling for meetings with the opposition, but by the opposition, they're limiting it to the parliament. I'm not so sure that other groups outside of the parliamentary groups do not also have something to contribute. You know, you have to think creatively, and I feel that the government needs to put on a cap that is not based on rancor or looking for spoils and getting the better out of arguments, which is what they seem to be consumed with right now to me as an outsider.
Mhm.
And to find a way to generate a broader vision, a broader sense of purpose, because we got to get the country behind this endeavor. I want the country to feel good about the oil. To see it only as a negative and being portrayed every day is not healthy. It's almost to deny the realities, and we can't keep fooling ourselves forever. Because despite what is you were saying there, realities still continue to work their way through the system and through the economy. Guyana is driving along an economic path that needs guidance and needs the confidence and the participation of all its people. And until that is done, we will probably end up fighting over not just the spoils, but the right to determine the path with which we have to agree that we must go.
Yeah.
So that is
Professor,
part of the problem we have, governance.
yeah, yeah, Professor Clive Thomas here, clarifying his position. I know I've gotten a lot of questions from you all in relation to his position, his emphasis on the reality, and that is that we are sitting pretty, but in terms of our own internal politics, um, we have not been able to pull the two together, that objective reality, and of course our stalemate in Guyana. And Professor Thomas is saying we have to solve that stalemate. Professor, is there any country that you would hold up as a model that has been able to balance a good governance and and national management of the oil and gas economy? Is there a country that you can point us to that you think
Well,
is?
I try to avoid that type of thing because every country has to be seen in the context of its own realities. Some people talk a lot about what is happening in Northern Europe, in the Nordic states.
Norway and those
Yeah,
places, yes.
yeah. Some people talk nicely about what is happening in some parts, not all parts, but some parts of the Middle East. But I think everywhere there is an attempt to find a common purpose in driving forward. But what bothers me about Ghana is that the only place where I see the denial of reality as a leading force. Reading the press, you get the impression that everything bad is due to oil. That
But
God didn't do us any good by giving us oil.
yeah, but Professor, isn't that a consequence of our politics, our toxic
Yeah,
politics?
that's the point. That's the point I'm making. It is a consequence because the political groups were benefiting from this under the guise of journalism or whatever they might call it, or self promotion. A lot of vanity is involved too. That the people don't like to be left in the shadows, and they want to be in the forefront of the news. And the way to make news is to be extravagant in your positions. So if you say shut down the oil, and let's start as if we never had oil here, some people might be attracted to that. But I think most rational people around the world would tell us that we're mad. Because Guyana can't solve the world's problems. We have to solve our problems in the context of the world and see how we can help the world to solve its problems. Guyana is not big enough or resource abundant enough to make anything, not even a dent, not even a raindrop in a shower benefits to the whole world. So we have to tread very carefully. And that is why I focused on the Caribbean. Because if we can get this right, we can get an important part of the history that we know right. We can make this oil serve that larger purpose.
Professor, I have a question from one of the viewers, and that is the recent decision by Ecuador, which they put on the ballot to stop oil extraction in parts of that country. Talk about that, because Ecuador is in our region here in South America. It's a relatively small country. Is that a model for us?
I don't know enough about that, to be quite honest. I don't even know what proportion of the GDP is generated by the oil. I don't even know what reserves they are alleged to have, because I know that in Guyana there's contestation. Even Exxon and Chevron are both stating that we have 11 billion barrels of oil equivalent plus. But the government has come closer to my position, because in advertising the blocks, they said we had 24 billion, minus 25. So there's a contestation over that. I don't know the details of where it is in Ecuador. So I would be very dishonest if I were to offer a clear opinion on what Ecuador should do, because I really do not have the data. But I think for Guyana, there is no sense in adopting that type of approach. This is pure happenstance. I can't say that we foresaw this, but I think it's a benefit which we can ignore and bring all the circumstances together. I think we can balance multiple objectives in the pursuit of this happenstance, because we can get rid of poverty, which is the source of most environmental degradation.
Make that connection a little bit more manifest for us. The linkage between poverty and environmental destruction.
Well, we know that from all the evidence around us.
Mm-hmm.
Less hygiene, less basic services, deprivations of all the protections you need to do to generate an environment that is healthy and prosperous. All those things come with lack of resources. And poverty is the best indication of lack of resources.
Professor Clive Thomas here, as usual, answering questions. If you have any questions for Professor Thomas, just shoot them to me. And even if I don't get him to answer it on today's program, certainly when we come back next week, we will answer those questions. Professor, there's been a lot of talk recently about taxes, and a lot of frenzy around it, and some groups are very vocal on it. What are the issues? What are they quarreling over?
Well, they're quarreling over the fact that they feel that the companies are not paying enough taxes. I think while that must be our basic posture, that we try to get more out of our companies than they're giving now. We have to recognize, at least in the way we approach it, the fundamental reality that taxation is not manna from heaven. We don't have no state in the world has a God-given right to taxes. States are allowed to tax their citizens based on the contract that the laws governing the taxation are clear, the regulations governing the taxation are clear, and the administration of the tax system is clear, fair, and equitable. Now, once we do that, the economic agents that generate income and become liable for tax must follow the laws and the rules and the regulations that govern how that profit can be established before they can get a claim date. But the persons who own companies or the institutions that own companies have bought their shares on the presumption that those who are running the company have a bounden duty to minimize their payment in tax. Because tax is not money from heaven, it's not a God-given right. So they must follow the rules of the laws, and they must therefore, in trying to pursue the minimization of that taxation payment, ensure that they follow all the rules, all the regulations, and they do not evade any tax that they are bound to pay. Because of that, all countries recognize that tax evasion is a crime. To evade your taxes, to either do so by fraud or deliberate non-payment is a criminal offense. But the avoidance of a tax, ensuring that the tax that you pay to the authorities are due to them by law, regulation, and administration, is all the tax that you are entitled to pay. You're not required to pay no gifts over to the state. You are entitled to pay the taxes that the laws and the rules and the regulations require you to pay. So unless there's a mens rea, as the lawyers call it, a legal intent to evade the tax, there's nothing wrong with avoiding the tax. So in societies where the major generation of wealth comes from the private industry, it is recognized that avoiding taxes is in fact a legal operation. Firms can avoid paying taxes as individuals can, as long as you do so within the laws and the regulations that govern taxation. But you cannot evade. So what they tend to do is to confuse avoidance and evasion. And I think the point of doing that is mainly to score political points. Because sometimes even the sums that are disputed and make the headline paper, people were calling me before this meeting. How could the government take away all the money from, allow all the money for Exxon to take away? I said, how much money? Because I don't own the paper yet. The guy said 100 million. I said, you know what the GDP in Guyana is? He said, I said, 7.3 billion. What percent of that 100 million is represented in the GDP? Just to show him the trivialization of the headline. 100 over 7 and 9 knots. No. You asking me 100 with 6 knots or 8 knots altogether, over 7 and 9 knots, would tell you already what a minuscule fraction that is. So the generation of the confusion is there in the numbers and the way it's presented. So it looks as if almost all the taxes were not being paid. When in fact it might be a small fraction.
Professor Clive Thomas here on our edition of Politics 101, our open word edition of Politics 101, weighing in on some of the issues over the last week. Professor, the president and the opposition leader met on the Venezuelan issue, put out a joint statement. Is that something positive?
As far as I'm concerned, yes. Because when we have a collective enemy, I would like to be assured that the political forces or the political class recognize that we have common enemies externally and try to deal with it in a harmonious manner. So yes, I was glad that it took place.
Some people are pointing to the inconsistency of the
Yeah,
government and
with the handshake.
are saying that Aubrey Norton should have played a little bit more hardball. Your comments on that?
Yeah, but it depends on how you see what you're doing. Are you doing it to enhance the position of the PNC, or are you doing it because the national injunction that if it's the latter, you can't play hardball at the same time. You have to be, I think, politically correct. Or I would say politically honest and do the right thing.
And do the right thing. Professor, staying on Venezuela, the entry of migrants from Venezuela continues. There are arguments as to whether these are economic migrants. Some people are positing that included in that group may be people who were sent in by the Venezuelans to help to destabilize Guyana. Is migration, in an earlier program, you did say because of where we have been going in terms of the wealth that is being generated and potentially down the road to be generated, that migration would have to be a fact of life. How do you see this increase in migration from Venezuela? Are there risks for us?
There are risks anytime that you have changes of that type, because all I've seen so far is, in fact, a couple of stuff sent to me on the WhatsApp showing the crowds and the border crossings of Venezuela. I found it a little surprising that somebody would be able to film so many people crossings at the same time, because that's not the guy I know of. But I treated that as maybe a false flag, that somebody had been trying to stir up some confusion. I didn't take it literally because I couldn't see the faces. I couldn't tell if they looked Venezuelan or looked Guyanese. What clothing they were wearing, nothing at all in the WhatsApp that I received. I sent it to a few people, including maybe you.
Yes, you did send it to me. But let me press you a little bit more on that.
But that is a risk that we run.
Yeah.
But you can't be a prosperous oil exporter or not have pressure on your borders all the time.
Right.
And the pressure will come not only from mass migration like that, which I believe may signify people looking for work, looking for a way to enter the production system. But there will be criminals and there will be bandit exploiters.
And that's where I was going. So you
gang members and so on. Yes, yeah. That type of migration will become more and more part of it. So the border becomes a different place. It's no longer the relaxed environment where somebody stays in a cubby hole and every now and again a few people pass when they expect the bus to come and you wave them on. Because of an active intelligence points that you begin to monitor the movement of people, identification, where they're coming from, why they're coming, all that type of thing. So it marks a transition of all our modes of operation. It's not only a transition of the mode of production, but of the modes of the civil services of the operations too. So we got to step up our game. That would be my if I were advice.
Yeah.
But the border region has always been a little bit loose. Because where I worked before, we were trying to enter arrangements where seized stuff on the borders, particularly in territories that were not Guyana, would be handed over to that agency and to work cooperatively on it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know where that is now.
Yeah. Professor, let me bring you in on a couple of subjects, and we talked about good governance. There is a report out today in the papers where members of the opposition in Parliament, members of the Oversight Committee, have indicated that since the government amended the standing orders to ensure that at least 2 government members must be there for a quorum, that that committee has missed 22 meetings. Now, you have dealt with corruption and so on, so you're no stranger to this. That committee, that sectoral committee, is meant to as an oversight of government spending and so forth. Isn't that really a breach of good faith when it comes to governance?
I would think so, and I think that they should make a fuss of it in the Parliament, as well as the press, as well as even maybe in the streets in terms of some popular manifestation to show their displeasure. I think all these things that we set up, we have to be vigilant to make sure they're working, because these are the safeguards. You don't want to have another Mahathir incident where you find that all the rules and regulations that you have left there are not being followed until there's a major accident. So I think that the rules should be tightly followed.
Yes.
But you know what they say in Guyana, people don't like to follow up. Meetings are boring and so forth.
Yes, as part of our culture. But of course, that's worrying. Professor, let me take you back a little bit so that we can come forward. You, in your individual capacity as a scholar and as part of the WPA, have argued, going back to the 1970s, that we need a political solution in Guyana as a prerequisite for the kind of robust economic development to happen. And towards that end, in 1979, the WPA had proposed a government of national unity and reconstruction. That, of course, was 44 years ago. Now, are you still wedded to that construction of a political solution and to put in place a political architecture to give meat to that solution? Are you still of that view?
Yeah, I'm strongly of that view. I would say for a party like the WPA, it's an absolute necessity that it grounds itself in the commitment to a national solution, which is testimony to the fact that they're willing to put their own priority interest as a party to be able to participate in governance as secondary to that national solution. I personally believe it may not be the position the party takes, but I personally believe that expressing a commitment to support any national government that involves the major political forces does not require our participation in it to validate it.
Mm-hmm. Got you. The Government of National Unity and Reconstruction, loosely power sharing, they sometimes refer to it as shared governance. It is had intense debate attached to it over the years. Both of the major political parties have theoretically embraced it from time to time, maybe not as consistently as they should. But is that still, that model of government, is it still perhaps the best option for us as a form of government?
I think the only option that I see in the near future. I don't know if something else might turn up 10 years from now. I don't know. But at this particular juncture, and the fear that I have is that with the rapid growth of incomes and the consolidation of the wealth and the growth in the power and capacity of the state, we don't want to leave out the national solution from its construction and its evolution and the forces that empower it to go forward, because it might be too late. Because I can see these resources being so powerful that I can't see down the road any real capacity to challenge it evolving in a place like Guyana. So the mechanisms for its treatment and solution need to bear fruit soon, before the next elections. That's my view.
Professor Thomas, I'm going to call on you to deal with a subject that some may think is theoretical, but I would argue that it is more than theoretical. The term "the state" is more and more getting into popular usage. We talk a lot about the petro state. We're hearing now about the successor state. And it is normal for people to conflate government and state. There's a distinction. I remember your book, 1984, The Rise of the Authoritarian State in the Periphery, was so useful to me, for me, in clarifying the difference between state and government, and informed my both my master's thesis and my PhD dissertation, which dealt with the rise of the authoritarian state in Guyana. Your book dealt with the rise of the authoritarian state in the periphery, and you use the states in Africa and the Caribbean as your exemplars. Explain for us the difference between the state and the government, because as I remember it, your that 1984 book, in many regards, argued that the post-colonial state itself had manifestations and some resemblance to the colonial state itself. I think that was part of your thesis. Anyhow, explain to us the difference between the state and the government.
Well, the confusion most people often make, because they see the cabinet, they see the expression of the ministers and so forth, and their control of the various departments has been evidence of the state, and therefore evidence that maybe of the whole society and its management. But the state is part of the society, part of its functioning. Other elements make up the state, including the legal departments, the executive, state, the public service, and so forth.
The military.
The armed forces, the security forces, like before they call them now, so they cover both the police and the army. Dealing with internal security and national security. So the distinction, I think, is very important as we go forward. But in situations that originate in authoritarianism, which the colonial state was, it is easy to want to conflate all. So governments want to control usually They want to control the military. They want to control the public service. They don't see them as operating as separate independent entities, trying to evolve and to balance the forces within the society so that you have some capacity for the rule of law to become the most important element in governing behavior of all the participants in the state. And that means that what is a challenge at every stage is in fact the security power, the ability to control the force in the society. And if the government becomes preoccupied with just saying I rely on the army and the police, that is a descent into authoritarianism that we have to be very careful of in this era. That is why even a country like yours now, where we're living now, in the United States, is fear that some major structural changes might come if the Democratic Party lose elections.
Yeah.
That the public service might no longer be a public service. It may no longer be an independent agency. It may be employees of the president. The things we took for granted, like independent public corporations, might no longer exist because they be corporations of the White House, where the state controls them. The state determines who leads them, who heads them. It may even be that the Department of not the National Security, the Justice Department, Department of Justice, becomes directly under the control of the president, rather than operate theoretically and practically as a separate independent agency, not being directed by the president to pursue anything but the national justice and not pursue the justice of the president. So all those things are there. The growth of paramilitary forces, the growth of instructions that don't have to meet any test of rule of law, of public credence before they are made into law. All that disappears. And the thing is that such models are growing out rapidly around the rest of the world. You have Orban, you have what's happening in Israel now. You have a lot of forces that are allegedly democratic, that are seeking to undermine that type of government. And that's the fear that I have going forward, that we're at a juncture where these new experiments, not experiments, these descents into what I would call fascism become routinized.
So,
and I never thought I would see it like in the United States, but I can see a theoretical possibility here.
Yeah. So, in effect, Professor, the party that forms the government could modify the state,
of course,
negatively or positively.
Of course.
Yes, and so the state are those autonomous.
And you see it, and in our countries, remember the governor had that authority as a representative of the colonial power.
Yes, yes.
So they could say they inherited the super president and the powers that he or she had into their administration.
Yes, and for those of you who are curious, if you can put your hand on the rise of the authoritarian state in the periphery by Professor Clive Thomas in 1984, it's still, for me, the most authoritative explanation of the evolution of the state in the Caribbean. Of course, also in places like Africa, some parts of Asia. I remember there was a distinction between the Caribbean and Africa and Latin America, the bureaucratic state here, and so forth. And that brings back memories here. So those of you, you know, these things can be found on Amazon because I'm sure it's out of print. It was published by say,
Macmillan.
Macmillan, right. Professor, this past week was the 40th anniversary of the collapse of the Grenadian Revolution. I would argue that you and your generation of scholars were pivotal in laying the framework for the coming of the Grenadian Revolution, and so therefore you had an interest in how that revolution itself evolved. It lasted for 4 years, 4.5 years. And we all know the story. Younger generation may not know it. But 40 years on, are there lessons for the present from what happened there in Grenada?
Yeah, I think there are many lessons, but we can't pursue them now.
Yes.
Because I'm running out of batteries.
Right.
But I think the most important is the degeneration into pure formalism, where the ideology becomes the practice and the life and the purpose of the movement. And where you begin to argue and debate and put heavy wages on the meanings of terms and words, to the point that you lost your sense of balance or credence as to where you were actually, what you were actually in, and the place you were actually located, and the risks that you were actually undertaking, not only to yourself, but to your population.
And on that note, Professor, we are going to bring this edition of Open Word to a close. When we come back next week, we're going to kick it off with a little bit more of your reflections on the Grenadian Revolution as it relates to the present. The last point you made there about the formalism and the arguments over symbols and labels and so on, that it's one of the things, one of the lessons that we can draw from the Grenadian Revolution. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, don't mention David.
Again, Professor Clive Thomas, economist, developmental economist, founding member of the Working People's Alliance, and someone who is valuable not just to us in Guyana, but to our larger Caribbean. I want to thank you all for staying with us. Hope you've been able to answer a few questions, clarify some issues, and after all, that is what this program is about. See you all tomorrow for another edition of Politics 101.
One race from the same place that make the same trip on the same ship. So we must push one common intention. It's for a better life in the region, for we women and we children. That must be the ambition of the Caribbean.